Welcome everyone to this Marts&Lundy webinar. I'm Doug Stewart. I'm chairman at Marts&Lundy, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you and to welcome my longtime friend and colleague and client, Peter Hayashida, who is Vice Chancellor for University Advancement at the University of California, Riverside, where he also serves as president of the UCR Foundation. Peter, we're looking forward to your comments a little bit later in the webinar. This session is being recorded, and a couple of housekeeping items. We are going to be taking questions at the end of the session, but you can enter questions at any time using the Q&A function. I also want to note that with about 300 participants today, we have a number of different types of institutions and organizations represented, from universities and independent schools to health sciences and healthcare, social service agencies, and arts and culture organizations, all of varying sizes. I think that you will find that the principles and fundamentals that we're talking about today for a campaign should resonate with you regardless of the type of organization you're in or the scope of that program. So let me begin with a few opening remarks about campaign planning and execution. We find when we are thinking about planning a comprehensive campaign that there are three essential drivers of success: the case, the constituents, and the catalysts. And it's hard to imagine you're being able to plan a comprehensive campaign without looking at each of these three and without all of the necessary elements of campaign planning falling into one of these three key drivers of success. So let me plunge right in with the case and talk a little bit about what we're looking for there. You often think about the case for a campaign being a printed case statement, but here I'm really talking about something that's much bigger. I'm talking about the mission of the organization, why the organization exists, and what its vision is for serving people in a region or a community, a state, a province, or the nation. We're talking about why your vision is urgent. Why should philanthropists care about it now? We're talking about what the role of philanthropy is. We're talking about why you can't accomplish what you want with government funds or with earned income from tuition or patient revenue or ticket sales. So we're talking about all of the elements that go into the case for support and the impact, and really what is going to be different at the end of this campaign, what is going to be different for the organization, and what is going to be different for the community and the constituents that you serve. How is the world going to be a better place because of this campaign? And I often say that you can have the most compelling case in the world, but if you don't have the constituents who are able to support it, we're not going to get anywhere with our campaign. And so we need to look at our constituent base, and we need to think about three essential elements there. Do they have capacity, financial capacity? Certainly you're going to have many, many donors at the $50 or $100 or $1,000 level, but in most cases that's not going to move the needle on your campaign. You need constituents who are going to be able to give you $50,000 or $5 million or whatever is scalable in your organization. So we have to make sure that your constituents have the capacity that is needed to achieve your campaign goals and aspirations. And then they can have all of the capacity in the world, but if they aren't attached and engaged, they're not going to give to their ultimate capacity. What's the difference between attachment and engagement? Well, attachment is passive and engagement is active. So you might have an alumnus of your college or university who thinks very highly of their alma mater, who had a great experience as a student. And if they were asked today what they think of their university, they would say, that they think it's a terrific place. They got a great education, and you know, they have happy memories from it. So they have high levels of attachment, and yet they're not engaged because they haven't been giving regularly. They're not volunteering. They're not on any boards or committees. They haven't been back to the campus in 10 years. They don't know any of the leaders. So we need a constituency that is both attached and engaged in the life of the institution or organization. And then I would say you could have the most compelling case in the world, and you can have constituents with capacity, attachment, and engagement, and that's not going to get you anywhere unless you have the catalysts to bring those together. The catalysts are the people and the resources who make the case come alive to your constituents and cause the constituents to take some action. So when I'm talking about catalysts, I'm talking about academic leaders or institutional leaders. This could be not only the president or the CEO or the deans, but in healthcare settings, it could be top physician leaders, even nurse leaders. It could be the orchestra director. It could be museum curators. It could be any of these institutional leader figures who are going to have to be able to tell the story about why your case is essential and why the campaign is going to make that case come to life. And then you can have all of the institutional leaders working on the same page, but you've got to have development staff who are going to be able to work the donor portfolios. And that means you have to have the right number of development staff and the right kind of development staff. So we're going to need to do some assessment of whether you are going to have a robust annual fund, whether you have robust major gift portfolios, principal gifts potential, and so forth, and make sure that we have the staff in place to fulfill the opportunities that you have. And then we're also talking about volunteers, whether it's at the board level or committee level, campaign councils or campaign cabinets, or even less formal volunteer roles, simply for a passionate donor to be able to make an introduction to another potential donor and share their enthusiasm for what you're doing in this campaign. And not mentioned here on this list, but really important, is resources. So that means not only the budget for the development program, but it means infrastructure like your database, your gift processing and gift acknowledgement capacity, and so forth, all have to be there and are considered part of the catalysts for the campaign. So let me mention just a couple of other planning elements in a comprehensive campaign before I turn it over to Peter to make these come alive in the story of UC Riverside's campaign. First, I think it's essential that your institution or organization have an institution-wide strategic plan. This really needs to precede campaign planning. Ideally, a campaign plan is going to flow out of the institutional strategic plan, reflect its priorities, and connect fundraising priorities to that strategy. Peter will talk a little bit about the use of campaign counsel. We're going to talk a little bit about the capacity analysis and feasibility study, which are two different tools in right-sizing your campaign and making sure that your campaign's goals and priorities resonate with donors. The capacity analysis is something that we've developed over the last 15 years, which uses predictive modeling and a quantitative approach to really understanding your capacity, how much you can raise, where that resides in your gift portfolios, and what kind of staff you need to be able to penetrate that capacity. The feasibility study is a very old tool, one that Marts&Lundy invented way back in the 1940s. And it involves consultants going out and actually talking with potential donors, sharing with them a draft case for support or a prospectus, and getting their reactions to that. So the feasibility study while it used to be really important in helping us set goals, is more important, I think, today in helping check on whether particular priorities or themes or campaign elements resonate with your constituency. It used to be that 100 interviews were necessary to get a good feedback and good results. We now find that these studies have become so precise that we can interview the right 30 or 35 people and get a pretty good idea of how your campaign goals and priorities resonate with your constituents. Then really key to a campaign is planning for the volunteer structure. If you are a relatively small organization, that might be one campaign committee or cabinet. If you're a large, complex organization, it might be that you have multiple campaign committees, maybe at the school and college level at a university, maybe at the service line level in a healthcare organization, and in arts and culture organizations around various sub-priorities of your campaign. We'll talk a little bit about goals, objectives, and metrics. So obviously you're going to have a dollar goal for the overall campaign. You want to raise $100 million in total. But what are the sub-goals for that? What are your goals for endowment, for current operations, for facilities and capital? If you're an educational institution, what are your goals for faculty support, for student support, for research, and so forth? And do you have objectives or metrics beyond that that are non-monetary? Objectives like wanting to engage young alumni or first-time donors, things that you can measure in a campaign besides all of the dollar goals that we may have. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the time horizon. The average comprehensive campaign today is about 7.7 years long. We might typically see that broken into a quiet phase of 3 years and a public phase of 4 or 5 years, but that's going to vary depending upon your circumstances, as Peter will talk about in the case of UCR. So without further ado, let me introduce again Peter Hayashida from the University of California, Riverside, who's going to talk more about the elements of their $300 million comprehensive campaign, and first give you a little bit of a background look at UCR. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Doug, and thank you all for being part of this webinar. It's great to be here, and I'm going to try to do the best I can to apply some of the principles that Doug discussed. And remember that I'm collapsing 12 years worth of work into about 15 to 20 minutes worth of discussion. So there will be, by necessity, a 30,000-foot look at this. But I'm going to try to give as much detail as might be helpful for those of you who are contemplating or engaged in campaigns to be able to apply some of these principles. My own context for this work is American public higher education. I've been in the sector for almost 32 years. But I've also personally, outside of work, served on nonprofit boards in the social services and performing arts sectors. I've also had exposure to academic health centers. So a lot of the experiences I've had at the university have been informed and assisted by the work that I've done in my spare time to the extent that I've had it. And it really brings a level of richness to the work that I think will be useful. So let me first talk about the University of California, Riverside, which is an institution that was founded in 1954. We're located in Riverside County, which is a county just east of Los Angeles, about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. We're actually the 10th largest county by population in the United States. We tend to be grouped with our neighbor, San Bernardino County, to the north. The combined population of the two counties is about 4.5 million people. This is a pretty distinct region of California, not necessarily what people think of when they imagine California. Our college attainment in these two counties is 22%, which is almost 1/3 lower than the state average. Inland Southern California has lower median household incomes than coastal communities, and our dominant industries out here beyond sort of healthcare and education, as you might find in many other regions, are logistics and warehousing and agriculture. So a fairly different culture than what you might find in the coastal areas of California. We are a Carnegie Research One doctoral university, very high research. We have academic medicine. We have an NC2A Division I athletics program. We do not have football, so I get my Saturdays in the fall. We have almost 27,000 students. More than half of our students are first in their families to go to college. More than half of them come from families that make them eligible for Pell Grants, so very low income families. And about 85% of our students self-define and self-identify as non-white. We have been ranked #1 in the nation for social mobility by US News and World Report for the last 3 years, which is the entire 3 years that US News has been conducting that particular survey. And we are the region right around us, which is the Riverside, San Bernardino, Ontario Metropolitan Statistical Area, is the 13th largest MSA in the United States. So it's a pretty big population center, but we're still sort of considered basically a shoulder market on the Los Angeles region. So in terms of the context that I found when I got here, I arrived on July 1st of 2009. I was the 7th Chief Advancement Officer in this chair in the 10 years before I arrived. And that was a substantial amount of disruption and turnover that I think took its toll on the organization in many different ways that revealed themselves to me over the course of time. I was charged with planning and running our first comprehensive fundraising campaign and responsible for 4 departments: alumni engagement, development, university communications, and the advancement administration, which is advancement services, finance, all the internal infrastructure. So you'll remember that this is July 1st, 2009 was early in the Great Recession. It followed the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. When I arrived, there was no academic strategic plan, the document that Doug referenced earlier. And so one of the first things that had to happen before we could even get to the work of planning a campaign was sit down and actually do that. From the perspective of human capital readiness, I would say our academic leadership was not at that point ready for a campaign. There was very little selection and hiring of academic leaders prior to my arrival that emphasized their responsibilities in fundraising. So there's been a lot of culture change over the course of time. And I am now the longest serving senior leader on this campus, which is a strange and unusual position for a chief advancement officer to be in. We had volunteer leadership that was incredibly passionate and committed to the institution, but not necessarily focused on the philanthropic and resource development aspect of what we were doing. And within my own organization on the staff side, we had about 89 budgeted positions when I arrived, and 1/3 of them were vacant. So and two of our 4 department heads were interim. Another one was preparing to retire. So I was really brought in to sort of fix some things and also get us up and running on the campaign. And what I did was I approached these problems using a framework that works well for my brain. It might help with your situation as well. But our campus has also applied the same framework to a variety of other problems and issues across our campus, including things like student success, where we were able to raise our graduation rates between 10 and 15 percentage points over the course of 5 years. So it's been a useful frame. And we basically start with the culture, then we start thinking about the people, and then we follow that with the appropriate programs that are designed to advance whatever the goal happens to be. Talking about culture, we ground our culture for advancement here at UC Riverside in alignment with the rest of the campus in 5 values: excellence, integrity, accountability, respect, and collaboration. Those are the values that I talk about ad nauseum. My team knows that I can memorize. I've got them memorized. I can talk about them, and I try to connect them in tangible, concrete ways to the work that we're doing with our constituents as well as with our partners across the institution. We have in our work of advancement, and particularly in fundraising, 2 vital assets without which we cannot be successful. One is our people, and the other is our data. And so what I did in my early time here was to really prioritize getting those 2 components really firing on all cylinders. So from a data perspective, we had a very unfortunate migration from a legacy database onto a new enterprise data management system. It was done suboptimally, to be kind, but little things like the migration disconnected spouses from each other, which, as you can all imagine, was a big problem for us. So we invested some money. I had some negotiations with the company, and we were able to get the data fixed and cleaned up. We then really focused on the people, and I say that sequentially, but it wasn't really sequential. It was simultaneous. And we thought about sort of how we bring people to this place. Convincing someone to live in Riverside, California is a very different value proposition than convincing someone to live in San Francisco or Los Angeles. The good news is our cost of living here is lower. The bad news is nobody's ever heard of us. So we really try to think about focusing our conversations with prospective employees on the mission of the institution. So for people who believe that first-generation low-income students deserve a world-class university experience, if we can get them into that brain space, then the idea is, as long as they bring the minimum skills required, we can train them up to be really strong contributors to our mission and to our organization. A mentor once told me that I can teach a good person how to be a great fundraiser. I can't teach a great fundraiser how to be a good person. And we really try to operate on that principle here at UC Riverside. It helps us not only with recruiting the right kinds of people who are going to fit well with the values of our institution, but also with retention, which we've worked very hard on as a high priority. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. We physically consolidated our staff into a more collaborative space. We had been previously housed in a former motel where the offices were motel rooms and each one had its own bathroom. And the culture here was to keep the doors closed. So you can imagine for collaboration, that wasn't very supportive as a physical infrastructure. And then we tried to emphasize the characteristics, the brand attributes of the advancement organization to the rest of campus. So we emphasized responsiveness, not only to our internal stakeholders, but to our external stakeholders. We worked on increasing our efficiency. We worked on rebuilding the trust and our reputation with, in particular, our academic leaders. So many of our academic leaders and partners around the campus didn't trust reports that came out of our organization. So we had to really work on rebuilding that sense of trust. I then had to hire a chief development officer. I had to hire a head of advancement services. The person who oversees communications then retired. We replaced her. And then our alumni director left to become a chief advancement officer at another institution. So I had to bring on a new alumni director. So it was a fully brand new team within 24 months after I started. So that leads me then into the people aspects of this. And so we spent a lot of time investing in hiring, training, and professional development. So this is a leadership, culture, and talent are big passions of mine, as is DEI. So from my perspective, we needed to create the kind of place where in an atmosphere, UC Riverside is an exceptional institution, but not rich. So we were not going to compete with Harvard and Stanford and Princeton and Yale on money. So we had to compete on culture. We had to be a place that people wanted to come to work and wanted to stay. And were able to and encouraged to learn and grow as they built their careers. So a lot of this investment we did was really on training supervisors to be better mentors and coaches for their staff, thinking about how people conceptualize careers in a profession that I would say has not done the best job it possibly can in laying out what that path might look like. So having early conversations with people about where they might imagine themselves going, figuring out what skills they have and what skills they need, and then giving them the resources and the support to bridge that delta between where they are and where they want to be. Part of that required renorming our performance management system. We had a little bit of a Lake Wobegon problem here. When I arrived, I was looking over the performance evaluations for the staff who were here, and shockingly, everybody was exceptional. And for those of you who know the old Garrison Keillor show, it was the Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, the men good looking, and the children above average. And so we had to really think through, did it make sense to, first of all, deprive people of the kind of feedback that helps them improve and prepare for responsibilities that might exceed the ones that they have today? And second, are we really being faithful to the institution by setting goals that are either too low or not aligned with the goals of the institution. So we then spent some time calibrating our incentives with our desired outcomes, and we redeployed or managed out consistent low performers. And that was a painful process. It's never easy to do that, but frankly, my first loyalty has to be to the institution and making sure that we're doing the work that we need to be doing to keep the organization functioning at its highest ability. We emphasize talent management. So not only the hiring piece, but the orientation, the onboarding, the coaching and mentoring, talking about the career pipeline and doing succession planning at all levels. I've always told people you should strive to be indispensable, but not irreplaceable, because the idea that people are going to move on is a reality of life. And if we prepare for it and plan for it, it becomes much less disruptive when it actually happens. And then finally, we wanted to model and reward data-driven decision-making. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I go through the components that we used in planning our comprehensive campaign. So having put all these people pieces in place, we then shifted to what kind of programs and initiatives and actions could we take that might help us reach our goals. And the first was an increased attention to high potential staff. So as managers, if you think about human behavior on the traditional bell curve, you've got people in the middle who are the backbone of the organization. They come in every day, they do good work, and they really are the engine that keeps the motor running. On the left end, we've got the people who are struggling. And as managers, we tend to spend a disproportionate amount of our time dealing with that group. On the right end of the tail are the people who are really pulling the organization forward. And unfortunately, just because of bandwidth and capacity issues, many of us as leaders and managers tend to spend a little less time on that end. So we very deliberately spent time on the upper end of that distribution. We instituted an annual employee engagement survey about 8 years ago. At first, it was a fairly simple 10-question homegrown survey that we created and put it on SurveyMonkey at the time. About 4 years ago, we transitioned into the Gallup Q12 survey, but we've been doing this very consistently. The questions have been pretty easy to align over time. Every single dimension we measure has improved during that time. We've pushed organizational decision-making down as far as it could go, because that's where people tend to feel the autonomy and the responsibility, the recognition to perform at high levels. We had to rebuild our annual giving programs, which had not been as proactive as we would need them to be for a campaign. And we've done all this to really, with an endpoint in mind, which is that we've increased our retention. More than 6 years in development is the average tenure, and across advancement, it's more than 7 years. So we're moving in the right direction relative to the industry in terms of having people who can sustain these long-term relationships that are really critical to the success of the campaign. We created a principal gift strategy team that is really an overlay to the 7 schools and colleges, athletics, library, university extension, all of the places on campus where we have touch points for donors. We really want to think about who's rising to the challenge of being the most significant donors, the 6, 7, maybe 8-figure donors who are going to be able to then help us get to this very aspirational, ambitious campaign goal that I'll talk about in a minute. We increased the evaluative and predictive data analytics capacity because we realized we had a lot of good data. We had gaps in our data, but you don't know what the gaps are unless you look at what's actually there to begin with. So we spent some time really understanding, what do we know about our alumni? What do we know about our donors? And how are we going to gather enough additional information so that we can make some predictions and deploy our resources as effectively and efficiently as possible in those areas where we're most likely to see a return to the institution. And then finally, we implemented structural mechanisms to increase collaboration among the alumni, development, communications, and advancement services teams. So we did things like creating cross-functional teams. The employee engagement survey is evaluated and recommendations are made by a cross-divisional team. We have a campaign closing team that activated last year when we were closing our fundraising campaign, and that was a cross-divisional team. We try to do as much as we can to lower barriers to collaboration. So information in our organization does not have to travel up, across, and down. It can just go across. The lateral lines are really important to us. And we try to create incentive systems that reward cooperation so that people see that there's a direct connection between their ability to collaborate and reach out across boundaries and the rewards and incentives that they get personally, financially, as well as their own satisfaction and fulfillment. On the next slide, there's a timeline, and it really helped me. I tend to be more of a visual learner, so thinking about what this process looked like, and what I'll tell you about this timeline is I think it encompasses all of the kinds of things that you'll want to think about. Not every organization will implement it the same way, and I'll tell you that if you look at and I'll dig into the phases in the next slide, but the quiet phase, public phase ratio wasn't what we had expected it to be. What I will tell you is that we had an absolute plan for how this was going to go, and it changed every month. So, and a lot of that was circumstantial. Some of that was because we discovered things that we hadn't thought about before. My last institution I was at for 19 years and was part of our second comprehensive campaign at that institution. There were a lot of things I learned on a second campaign that made me reflect on what could we do differently in a first campaign that might tee up that second effort in a little bit better way. So this is our timeline, influenced by our specific needs and circumstances. And then, you know, I will tell you that we were clearly on track for a more conventional quiet phase, and then our CEO left. So I'll talk about that on the next slide. So let's talk about the phases. So this pre-campaign planning phase, which is lasted for us from 2009 when I arrived to 2011, we created this academic strategic plan, which was by all measures a terrific blueprint for the campus in determining what our strategies and priorities were and where we wanted to be in 10 years. We called the plan UCR 2020. It was released in 2010. We had a series of goals and objectives that we wanted to accomplish. During that same time, we put out a request for proposals for campaign council. That was when our relationship with Marts&Lundy began. We did a wealth screening against our database, a pretty steely-eyed assessment of our pipeline. We ran our capacity analysis at the time and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but really thinking about our staffing and resource plan for this campaign, what the staff size would be, what the distribution might look like, and how we would organize people to get the work done most effectively. My last organization was extremely large. We had 550 advancement staff. My current team is 130, which is still big by nonprofit standards. But I think the principles that we put into place are really transferable if you have a staff of 6. My first job out of college, I was in an organization of 6 people. So I do understand the experience of having everybody doing everything. So then we moved into this sort of nucleus or quiet phase in 2011. And between 2011 and 2016, we really spent time recruiting our volunteer leadership, constructing a gift table and stress testing it to see if we really had the donor pipeline as well as the staff capacity to manage this plan, this ideal scenario of how we might construct and get ourselves to our goal. We did our feasibility study, which I'll describe in a little more detail soon. We did our leadership gift solicitations. We had expected to really fill a fairly robust pipeline of 7- and 8-figure gifts during this time. I would say we were disappointed in our eventual outcome, but we still managed to get there, but not in the way that we had imagined. By the time we did the public launch of the campaign, we were just over 50% of our campaign goal, which was $300 million. So in 2016, October 15th, actually 2016, we launched the public phase of our campaign. And between 2016 and 2020, we were all campaign all the time. And there was broader public participation, smaller gifts from many donors. We had a focus on our unit goals. So each of our units had their own financial goals. We wanted to sustain the momentum that is very hard to do when you get to those last few years of a comprehensive campaign, when everybody's tired, the donors are burned out, you've tapped all the wells, you're trying to find new donors to close that, or at least get existing donors ready to make their big gifts to close the campaign. And for me, what was really important, because I knew I wasn't going to be here for our second campaign, was building a base. We didn't want to drain the well on the first campaign and have nothing left for the second campaign. So it was really important for me to make sure that that second campaign, which will probably start in the middle of the 2020s, that our team collectively would know who our principal gift donors were. We just wouldn't know which ones of the tens of thousands of donors within our current universe they were. But you don't, as many of you know, it is rare to find a donor to pop into your donor pyramid at the top. They usually come in as annual gift donors, maybe leadership annual gift donors, but really thinking about what that pipeline might look like. And then we did a big closing celebration in the COVID spirit in February of 2021, which was entirely virtual, spectacular, but not probably the way that we would envision closing the campaign. So let me now dig in a little bit on the planning tools that Marts&Lundy helped us with. And the first thing that we really needed to do was this capacity analysis. And that was so critical for us because we really didn't know what the health of our pipeline was. We needed to do an analysis of our staff resources. We had certainly a baseline level of fundraising, plus an expected yield that would be above and beyond as a result of being in a campaign. We didn't know how much we could raise. The 10 years before I got here, we had some blips up and some blips down, but if you took the average, it was about $21 million a year. And to do a $300 million campaign with that base meant really changing the trajectory on the sustainable annual production of our fundraising program. So we constructed a variety of gift tables. I'll show you one, which is a gift table for $400 million. That was my first chancellor actually said, let's do 400 million. And the assessment that we had received from our colleagues at Marts&Lundy was that we could probably do a campaign between 250 and 350 million. But he sort of liked being a little bit closer to 400 million. And so we tested it, and it turned out to not be the right fit for us where we were developmentally. My new chancellor, who arrived in 2013, said, how about $500 million? That sounds really nice. And I said, $500 million sounds great, except that we don't have the prospects to get to $500 million. So we've settled into then, by the time we got to the public launch, of really landing on that number that we would not have found but for the capacity analysis. The campaign investment plan and the staffing plan went together, and that was really sort of my responsibility. What we did was I took from the capacity analysis the existing productivity of our team. Doug and I had conversations about what we thought the horizon to which we could push efficiency, number of dollars raised, number of visits per gift officer. And then we thought about the adds to staff that we might need in order to get us to the point where we could generate enough sustained annual giving to get to that $300 million target. And then we did so what I did was I created a very comprehensive investment strategy on a big spreadsheet that talked about how we were going to increase efficiency, how many people we would add in each year. It was a 5-year drawdown on an investment, a substantial investment from the campus. We created this in 2012, and I presented it to the chancellor right before he told me he was getting ready to leave. So I put that back in the file, and we had an interim chancellor for 7 months. We had a new chancellor in 2013 who I presented this model to. He and I spent a couple of years with him getting a grasp on the finances. We got a new provost at that time as well. But the argument that I made several times was a few things. First of all, you can't invest at the end of a campaign because by then the work is done. The second thing is titrating the investment over time was better for us because you can't absorb all the people and programs from an entire campaign investment in 1 year. It's just not realistic for the organization, particularly because we were striving to preserve the nature of the culture that we were building. And third, that the allocation of investments really were designed to not just reach our campaign goal, but to make sure that we have the resources after the campaign to sustain an annual fundraising production that would be what we anticipated to be double what our current fundraising production was at the time. The feasibility study was the last piece. As Doug said, they did interviews with key stakeholders within our universe. There were about 51 interviews, attitudes about the organization and leadership, philanthropy and campaign, our campaign objectives and priorities, gauging agreement with the campaign goal, and then asking them if they would be willing to help. So with all of that, what I will say is that we managed to finish the campaign at just under $313 million, that we tripled the endowment for the campus, that we doubled our sustainable annual production to about $40 million a year, that we have a team right now of 130 folks who are across the full range of advancement functions, who are probably one of the best advancement teams I've ever seen, much less worked with in the profession over my 3 decades in this field. And a lot of it boils down to the way that we approach our work, with an emphasis on long-term relationship building with our donors, on an emphasis on data-based decision-making, and on an emphasis on staying true to the values and the culture of our own organization. So we've got a few parting shots that I'll give Doug a chance to sort of weigh in on, sort of how from a sector standpoint, Doug has the advantage of being on a perch that allows him to see into a variety of organizations, whether it's the Cleveland Orchestra or George Mason University or Mass General Brigham, whatever it might be, and think about how these concepts tie across sectors. And then we'll take some questions and happy to answer any that you might have. So Doug.
Thank you, Peter. Great overview. I think the last point that you made is one that really resonates with me, which is that you are moving on from this campaign with an absolutely terrific advancement team, one that you should be very, very proud of. And you, Peter, have always said you want to be preparing for the next campaign. That's always been one of the objectives of this campaign. And I think you've done that not only in building infrastructure, but in building a culture and building a team that is really quite remarkable. So congratulations on that. Peter, I'm going to let you take a few parting shots, and then I have some questions for you. So I'll lead off the Q&A if you don't mind.
Sure, that sounds great. So the bullets on this slide, I'll just tell you that I said this at the beginning, I'll say it now, there is no single best approach. We took sort of the casebook approach to planning our campaign, and as I said, we were adjusting it constantly based on discoveries that we made. We had planned for 2 $50 million gifts, I think, at the beginning of our first gift table. And then when we adjusted our goal down, I think it might have been 2 $25 million gifts. We didn't receive a single $25 million gift, but we still managed to piece together what worked for our campus. We stayed very true to our culture, values, and goals. I particularly found retained counsel very helpful. Doug and I spent a lot of time talking through, was the annual giving program working in the way that we envisioned it to work? How could we increase our penetration for planned giving opportunities? And then really thinking a lot of my job is the blocking and tackling of the chief advancement officer, managing expectations of our academic leaders, managing expectations of our volunteers and donors. And also, as Doug said, I didn't bang this over other people's heads because this is really my problem. How do I make sure that we prepare the organization from a succession perspective so that the second campaign will be successful beyond people's wildest dreams? And then what I would encourage all of you to do, and someone made this comment at the very beginning about opening the chat, because there really is no problem that you're going to encounter that someone else hasn't already figured out a really elegant solution for. So rely on friends and colleagues and figure out a way to be successful without reinventing the wheel, because this is important work, it's customizable work, but it's also really valuable to think about how other people made mistakes, because I'm a big believer in making mistakes, but I like to make my own mistakes, not other people's mistakes. So the more I talk to my colleagues, the less inclined I am to make their mistakes.
Great, thanks, Peter. So we're getting a couple of questions, and I want to go to Annette's question first, which is, what are the components of a capacity analysis? Well, first, we look at what we call baseline giving. Now, baseline giving sounds like just everything that comes in the door in a given year. We think of baseline giving as what I think of as inelastic giving that does not typically respond to the priorities or the energy of a campaign. So baseline giving in this case would be most of your annual fund, most of your corporate and foundation gifts and grants, your realized planned gifts, and so forth. These are things that tend not to change a lot, whether you're in a campaign or not. So we do a 10-year retrospective analysis to come up with a forward-looking projection of that baseline from those different categories. And let's say that that's $100 million. We put that aside for a moment, and then we look at the elastic giving, or the gifts that we think are going to come in from major individual donors and family foundations because you are in a campaign and because of the priorities of that campaign. So we do both a financial and a risk-adjusted sort of attachment and engagement analysis of those prospects, and come up with another range of $150 to $250 million, or whatever the number may be. We combine that back with the baseline giving that's going to come in regardless of whether you're in a campaign, and we may say then that you have a capacity of $300 to $400 million, $350 to $400 million in raw capacity. And then the next step is that we do a staffing overlay on that. And we say, all right, so given the realistic gift table, the actual customized gift table that's created in this process for your organization, looking at where the major and principal and annual gifts lie in that, how many staff at different levels do you need to penetrate that capacity, and what kinds of performance do you need from those staff members? In other words, how many asks do they have to make a month or a year? How many closures do they have to make in a month or in a year? And then what are your current staff doing in terms of performance? And so we compare them, and you've ultimately got just two levers to adjust. You can either add more staff, or you can improve the performance of your current staff, or both. So those are sort of the elements, Annette, of a capacity analysis in a nutshell. Peter, I wanted to ask you to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which was you have, and I think the reason I want to ask this is I think this will resonate with a lot of people on this session. You had, at the beginning of this campaign or before the campaign, a set of volunteers, foundation board members, and so forth, who loved UCR and thought very highly of it, and were just they embraced the institution with loving arms. But as you said, they didn't necessarily take up the mantle of being fundraisers, identifying prospects, and giving to their capacity and helping get others to give. How did you turn that corner? Because you now have a volunteer board, a foundation board that I think is terrific. How did you move that barge in the course of just a few years?
Well, with no small cost to myself, I will say that the folks who were here when they got here had seen the parade of chief advancement officers march through here over the decade before I arrived, and assumed that they could wait me out. What I would say is that there's nothing personal against me. They felt that they were here to give advice. They were here to tell the campus what they thought as stakeholders in the institution. And what I needed to do was figure out how to get a foot in the door to culture change that would not put me constantly in the crosshairs. It's not that I didn't end up there on occasion, but what I did was I started by thinking through who the opinion leaders could be in the volunteer community and starting to insert them into leadership positions that allowed them to carry the water of, we're a foundation board, we should be raising more money, or we should be asking our friends to contribute, or we should be doing more personally to support this institution. It was a very controversial conversation that we had. And frankly, the nonprofit boards I've been on have gone through similar versions of this, although I would argue that community-based nonprofits do a much better job of prospectively telling people, this is what we expect you to do. At universities, we have a governing board for the 10-campus system. Our campus doesn't have its own separate governing board, so our foundation board assumed that was their job. reasonably so. And what I would say is that once we got a few key leaders in, then it was easier to surround the leader who was really forward leaning, who was thinking about what kind of board do we need to have a successful campaign, with other volunteers who felt similarly. Now, I will tell you that, and this is not something I'm proud of or pleased about, but there were some very devoted volunteers who decided to walk away from the institution at that point. And I wish I could, I hope they come back at some point. I'm getting ready to leave the institution. That might be their cue to come back. But I do feel that none of them had ill will. They all wanted what was best for the institution. But the volunteers who were here just didn't have the experience. My last institution is over 100 years old. So we had been through this, you know, how do you keep people from just thinking of themselves as friend raisers to really being active partners in fundraising. And so I really didn't feel like our institution could take 100 years to get there. We had to do it more quickly. And that did require some difficult conversations about giving minimums, which we didn't have, difficult conversations about term limits, which we didn't have, and different conversations about mandatory campaign commitments, which we didn't have, all of which we do have today. And I would say that the biggest factor in making it happen was just me refusing to leave, because I think people felt like if they could have just waited me out, that would have allowed for them to go back to doing what they were doing before. And I just didn't feel like, for my own conscience, I didn't feel like that was the best thing for the institution. And I knew that someone else coming in would have to get up to speed and have the same value system. And so I just, you know, I have a philosophy of staying until the job is done.
Thanks, Peter. We have a question from Neil for you, a practical question. He says, you touched on the notion of donors who have significant financial capacity entering at the annual giving level. How long do you think it should take to develop those donors into principal donors, and what strategies helped develop those donors from?
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Neil, thanks for the question. And you're at a zoo, so that's a little bit of a different context. But what I would say for any of us is the first step to determining that is going back and looking at your existing data to figure out who your biggest donors are and what their giving history was up until that point. So when I was at my last institution, when we finished our second comprehensive campaign, we looked at the top 100 donors to that campaign. And we measured the time between their first donation and their first $1 million donation. Now, at that institution, we had $650 million donors. So that time between first and first million was a significant milestone for us. It was 17 years. Now, the problem with that I saw with that from a talent perspective is in 17 years, a donor could have 9 development officers. So we had to fix that sort of leaky bucket on the staff side. But what I would say is that 17 years, it's not a should, it is what it is, right? For that subset of donors, their average first gift was $100. And almost always it went to the annual fund for unrestricted use, which is what I would argue is an early career test gift for a donor who might want to invest more later on. But getting them to the next level requires a certain amount of paying attention. So I have at least one gift officer here at UC Riverside who every day the list of all the gifts that came in during that day is distributed to all the gift officers. And I know for a fact that every day he looks at that list and he goes back and finds out if there's any blips in the giving, right? They've been giving $100 and all of a sudden they give $1,000. And he immediately picks up the phone, if they're not managed, he picks up the phone and calls them and says, wow, what a great gift. Thanks so much for doing that. Do you mind if I ask what prompted the big increase? And sometimes we find people who are raising their hand. They're raising their hand madly. I have a board member who about 15 years ago was called by our annual fund and asked to make a gift. And he was listening to the pitch from the student. And he said, put me down for 25. And the student said, $25. And he said, 25,000. And he said that the phone sort of went dead. He said, are you still there? And the caller said, I'm here. Thank you. And then he sent his check in and he never heard anything. So it's that kind of stewardship that I think allows people to then, when they've raised their hand in that way, to be recognized as someone who's ready and willing to have the conversation about a deeper commitment. Maybe and by the way, the definition of a major or principal gift varies a lot by institution, right? For some places it's 25 or 50,000. For other places it's 25 or 50 million. For other places it might be more than that. But however you define that window, knowing what it is that what the outcome is that's desired, and then being able to notice when people are raising their hands to step up to a higher level of giving is, in my experience, the best way to compress that cycle so that you can get them from loyal annual donor to principal giving donor or major gift donor as quickly as possible.
Great. Thanks, Peter. My friend Patricia has the last question for the day. She is asking what role alumni played in the campaign versus community members. And that's, I think, really a relevant question for you because UCR is a relatively new institution and it certainly has grown tremendously in recent years. So many of your alumni are young and not in their prime giving years. So how would you answer Patricia's question about the role that alumni played versus community members?
So participation was a component. We had about 7 or 8 different goals for our campaign. And what we wanted was at least 10% of our living alumni, which at the time we closed the campaign was about 125,000 living alumni, at least 10% having made a gift to the campaign. That was a big hurdle for us for a couple of reasons. One, more than half of our graduates are under age 40. So we have about 135,000 graduates now, more than half under age 40. Beyond that, our graduates come from families that don't have deep histories of giving to universities. They may be giving to houses of worship. They may be doing remittances to another country. They may be giving to other family members, but they don't necessarily give institutionally. So we had to really think about what the case was going to be for giving for that group. We did surpass our alumni participation goal. We didn't use a percentage, we used an absolute number. And what I would say is that alumni played an important role in fueling the energy and the excitement around a campaign because of the way that we were able to tell the stories of the students and the research that benefited from their gifts. But in terms of actually getting us over the dollar number, it was primarily either older alumni in a couple of cases or community members or donors who had some other relationship to the campus but were not graduates.
Great. Thanks, Peter. And thank you for all of you participating in this session. Thank you, Peter Hayashida, for your insights and wisdom. I hope everyone feels like this was helpful, and remember the 3 C's, the case, the catalysts, and the constituents. More resources are available on the Marts&Lundy website. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.